A few summers back, a neighbor of mine got a quote to replace about 140 feet of old wooden fence along her back property line. $6,000. That number stuck with me. Mostly because the fence itself wasn't doing much of anything. It blocked her view of the neighbor's shed. And that was about it. No flowers. No shade. No birds stopping by. Just boards. Slowly warping in the weather. Waiting for the day they'd need to be replaced all over again. That conversation got me thinking about the fences I've put up over the years. And how many of them I'd happily trade for something alive. Something that gets better with time instead of worse. There are shrubs real. Honest, native shrubs that can do a fence's job and then some. One stays green through the coldest part of winter. One thrives in the soggiest corner of a yard where grass won't grow. Another turns a bare property line into a spot where birds actually want to raise their young. None of them are magic. All of them have trade-offs. But if you've got a fence on its way out, or a long stretch of yard you've been dreading the cost of enclosing, I think you'll want to hear about these 5. Why conventional fences cost more than expected. The number on the estimate is never really the whole number. That's the part people learn the hard way. There's the material itself: wood, vinyl, chain link, composite, and then there's labor, which in a lot of parts of the country now costs more than the materials do. Posts need to go in below the frost line, which means digging concrete, and either a crew or a weekend of your own sweat. A gate adds its own hardware that will eventually need adjusting or replacing, and permits, in some municipalities, add a line item before a single post goes in the ground. That's just the installation. A wood fence needs staining or sealing every few years if you want it to last. And pressure washing in between. Storms take their toll a downed limb. A hard wind. And suddenly, you're replacing panels instead of touching up paint. Chain link rusts. Vinyl cracks in extreme cold. Every material tells some version of the same story. It looks sharpest the day it's finished and depreciates steadily from there. I won't pretend there's one number that applies everywhere. Costs swing wildly by region. Material, terrain, and local labor rates. But the pattern holds almost everywhere. A fence is a depreciating asset from day one. What a living fence can and cannot do. A hedge of native shrubs runs in the opposite direction. It's worth the least the day you plant it thin. Small. Not doing much of anything yet, and it gets more valuable. More beautiful. And more functional with every passing year. Assuming you've chosen the right plants for the site. That's the real appeal here. Not just privacy, but privacy that improves instead of degrades. A living screen softens a property line instead of drawing a hard edge around it. Depending on what you plant, it can offer flowers in spring, berries in summer or fall, structure in winter, and habitat for birds and pollinators the entire time it's growing. If one plant dies or gets damaged, you replace that one plant, not an entire section of fencing. And you can plant it in phases, a little at a time, as your budget allows, which isn't really an option with a contracted fence installation, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I made this sound like there's no downside. Shrubs don't give you privacy on day one. It takes real years, often 3 to 5. Sometimes longer before a young hedge fills in enough to block a clear sightline. Young plants need consistent watering while their root systems establish. Especially in the first couple of growing seasons. If you choose deciduous species, meaning ones that drop their leaves, you're going to have a thinner, more open screen in winter. Right when you might actually want the privacy most. Roots and branches need real space to mature into. So you can't just jam them shoulder to shoulder for instant coverage. Some species spread by suckers, sending up new shoots from the roots, which can be a feature or a headache depending on how you feel about that. Berries that feed the birds also drop and stain, and occasionally make a mess on a patio or driveway underneath. And if you've got a pool, many local ordinances still require a physical fence around it, regardless of what else you plant. A hedge won't satisfy that requirement. And it won't contain a dog or a toddler the way a solid fence will either. Go in with that full picture. And a living fence becomes a genuinely smart long-term decision rather than a disappointment 3 years in. Planning before choosing a shrub. Before I introduce you to the 5 shrubs themselves, it's worth walking your own property with a few questions in mind. Because the right plant for your neighbor's yard might be entirely wrong for yours. Start with your USDA plant hardiness zone, which rules out or confirms a lot of options before you get to personal preference. Think about what's native to your specific region. Not just native to the United States, broadly, a shrub native to Florida's coastal plain may be entirely out of place in Minnesota. Look at your sunlight and at how your soil drains after a hard rain. Measure the width you actually have to work with, not just the length of the property line, and decide how tall you want the finished screen. Ask how much winter privacy genuinely matters, since that one question eliminates or confirms several species right away. If deer are a regular presence, that changes things considerably. Call before you dig, so you know where utility lines run. And check for overhead power lines that might conflict with a shrub's mature height. Confirm your actual property boundary. A surveyor's stake beats a guess, and consider how far branches will spread past the trunk. Check HOA rules before falling in love with a design. And leave yourself room to walk the hedge's length for future pruning. For species-specific confirmation in your exact area, your state's Cooperative Extension Service, a local native plant society, a conservation district, or a reputable native plant nursery will know more than any general video can. The 5 native shrubs. Wax Myrtle Morella cerifera. Let's start with the one that solves winter privacy, because that's usually the first question people ask. Wax myrtle is native to the coastal plain of the southeastern and mid-Atlantic United States, from roughly Texas up through New Jersey. And it's one of the few broadleaf shrubs that stays green through the entire year across most of that range. Evergreen to semi-evergreen, depending on how far north and how cold your particular winter gets. It's happiest in USDA zones 7 through 9, though it can handle brief cold snaps into the lower end of Zone 6 with some dieback. Left alone, it'll mature into a large shrub or small multi-stem tree, typically 10 to 20 feet tall and nearly as wide. So give it room. This isn't a plant for a narrow side yard unless you're prepared to prune regularly. It wants full sun to partial shade and, refreshingly, isn't picky about soil. It tolerates wet, poorly drained ground as easily as it tolerates sandy, dry conditions. And it even shrugs off salt spray, which makes it a favorite along the coast. Growth is fast for a broadleaf evergreen, often 2 feet or more a year once established. So a young hedge fills in noticeably quicker than most alternatives on this list. The aromatic, waxy leaves have a spicy scent when crushed, and small blue-gray berries form on female plants in fall, which songbirds, particularly yellow-rumped warblers, further north during migration rely on as a genuine food source. Male and female flowers grow on separate plants. So if berries and bird activity matter to you, it's worth confirming you're getting female specimens, or simply planting several so the odds work in your favor. The main caution here is regional push wax myrtle too far north or into consistently harsh winter conditions, and it either dies back to the ground or fails outright. So this is very much a warm climate solution. It can also sucker and spread somewhat in loose, sandy soil, which some homeowners appreciate for a naturalized look and others find requires occasional control. If you're in the Southeast or Mid-Atlantic and want a fast, genuinely evergreen screen that handles difficult soil, this is likely your strongest single option. If you're gardening in a colder climate, skip ahead. This one isn't for you. Ninebark Physocapus opulifolios. Now for the plant that answers the opposite question, the one for gardeners who need speed and cold tolerance more than year-round green. Ninebark is native across a wide swath of the central and eastern United States, from the Great Plains through New England and down into the Appalachians, and it's remarkably cold hardy, comfortable in USDA zones 2 through 7, which covers a lot of ground that wax myrtle simply can't touch. It's deciduous, meaning it drops its leaves in fall, so it won't give you the winter screening the previous shrub does, but what it lacks in evergreen coverage, it makes up for in speed and toughness. A mature ninebark typically reaches 5 to 8 feet tall and wide for straight species, though some modern cultivars stay more compact. Worth knowing, since a cultivar bred for smaller stature or darker foliage color may sacrifice some of the vigorous growth and wildlife value of the wild-type plant, it grows in full sun to partial shade and tolerates an unusually wide range of soil conditions, from clay to sandy, wet to fairly dry, which makes it one of the more forgiving choices on this list for a homeowner who isn't entirely sure what kind of soil they're dealing with. Growth rate is fast, often a foot or more annually once roots are established. So a ninebark hedge closes in noticeably quicker than most flowering shrubs. In late spring, it produces clusters of small white to pale pink flowers that draw in bees and other pollinators, and the exfoliating bark reddish-brown strips that peel and curl with age adds genuine visual interest once the leaves have dropped, which is a nice consolation for a plant that isn't evergreen. It's not a major wildlife food source, the way some shrubs on this list are, but it does offer nesting cover and some seed value for birds. The main drawback, beyond losing its leaves in winter, is that some straight species can look a bit rangy or overgrown without occasional pruning. So it benefits from being cut back hard every few years to keep it from getting leggy at the base. If you're gardening somewhere genuinely cold, and you want a fast-filling, low-fuss screen that isn't fussy about soil, ninebark is one of the most dependable choices you'll find. If winter privacy is your top priority, it won't be enough on its own. Serviceberry Amelanchier canadensis. I want to introduce this next one through the calendar, because it's really a plant defined by its seasons. In late March or April, before most other shrubs have even leafed out, Serviceberry breaks into a cloud of small, white, star-shaped flowers. Often, when the branches are still bare, it's one of the earliest and most reliable spring blooms you'll get from a native shrub. Native primarily to the eastern United States, from the southeast up through New England and into parts of the upper Midwest, it's suited to USDA zones 4 through 8. And it does best in full sun to light shade with reasonably moist, well-drained soil. Though it tolerates some drought once it's established, grown as a multi-stem large shrub rather than trained into a single trunk tree, it typically reaches 15 to 25 feet tall and 10 to 15 feet wide at full maturity. So it's a substantial screening plant, pruned and maintained as a hedge. You can keep it considerably smaller, but you should plan for its natural size rather than fighting it constantly. Growth rate is moderate, not as fast as ninebark or wax myrtle, but steady. After the spring flowers fade, small berries develop through early summer, ripening to a deep reddish purple, genuinely edible, with a flavor somewhere between blueberry and almond. If you're willing to compete with the birds for them, which you generally won't win, since cedar waxwings, robins, and a long list of other songbirds tend to strip the branches within days of ripening. Fall brings strong orange to red foliage color, which rounds out a shrub that's doing something worth looking at in 3 separate seasons. It's deciduous, so like Ninebark, it won't hold winter privacy on its own. The main limitation is size and patience. This isn't an instant hedge, and it needs real room to reach its mature spread without constant pruning against its nature. It can also be susceptible to certain rust diseases in some regions, particularly where eastern red cedar grows nearby. Since the two share a fungal life cycle, it's not usually serious, but it's worth knowing about. If ornamental value across multiple seasons matters more to you than year-round density, and you've got the space for a large shrub, Serviceberry earns its place. If you need a tight, narrow screen in a small side yard, it's probably not the right fit. C. American Elderberry Sambucus canadensis. Let's talk about this one through the birds it brings in, because that's really the heart of why people plant it. American elderberry is native across most of the eastern and central United States, from Florida up into southern Canada and as far west as the Great Plains. Comfortable in USDA zones 3 through 9, across most of that range. It wants full sun to partial shade and, notably, prefers consistently moist soil. It's naturally found along stream banks, ditches, and low spots. So a dry, sandy corner of your yard isn't where it'll be happiest. It grows fast, often 3 to 5 feet in its first couple of seasons once established, eventually reaching 6 to 12 feet tall and equally wide, spreading via suckers into a broad, multi-stemmed thicket rather than a tidy, contained shrub, which is worth knowing up front, since it will spread wider than the spot you originally planted it unless you manage it. In midsummer, it produces large, flat-topped clusters of small white flowers, followed by heavy clusters of small dark purple berries in late summer that birds everything from cardinals to catbirds to orioles descend on almost as soon as they ripen. The flowers themselves are also a strong pollinator draw, particularly for a range of native bee species. Because of that suckering habit, elderberry works best where you have room to let it spread into a natural thicket rather than a precisely maintained hedge line. And it's genuinely one of the higher value wildlife plants on this list, both for the berries and for the insect life, the flowers and foliage support. The main caution is site moisture. Plant it somewhere dry, and it will struggle and look thin, no matter how well you otherwise care for it. It also isn't the plant to choose if you want a neat, formal head shape, since keeping it contained requires real annual effort. And it's worth noting the raw berries, stems, and leaves contain compounds that are toxic uncooked. So, if you've got young children who might sample berries off the bush, that's a factor to weigh. Even though properly cooked elderberries are a well-known food and folk remedy, if you've got a low, damp corner of the yard and you want to maximize bird activity, this is likely your best option on the list. If you want tidy and contained, look elsewhere. Woo! Buttonbush Cephalanthus occidentalis. I've saved this one for the site that gives most homeowners the hardest time, the corner of the yard that simply won't drain. Buttonbush has one of the widest native ranges of anything on this list, found across most of the eastern, central, and even parts of the southwestern United States. And it's genuinely happy in USDA zones 5 through 10, depending on the source population, What sets it apart is its tolerance, even preference. For consistently wet soil, it grows naturally along pond edges, in ditches, and in seasonally flooded areas. And it will tolerate standing water for extended periods that would kill most other shrubs outright. A mature buttonbush typically reaches 6 to 12 feet tall and wide. With a somewhat loose, rounded form, it wants full sun to partial shade. And while it's best known for thriving in wet ground, it's more adaptable than people expect. It will also grow in average garden soil, as long as it isn't allowed to dry out completely for extended stretches. Growth rate is moderate to fast in consistently moist conditions. Slower if the site is drier than it prefers. Its signature feature is the flower round, white, pincushion-like globes that bloom through mid to late summer. Genuinely unlike anything else on this list. And they draw in an enormous range of pollinators, from bumblebees to swallowtail butterflies to hummingbirds. The seed heads that follow provide food for waterfowl and other birds into fall and winter, particularly in properties near ponds or wetlands. The obvious limitation is that this isn't a plant for dry, well-drained soil. Put it somewhere that dries out in summer, and it'll struggle and likely decline over a few seasons. It's also deciduous, so it offers no winter screening. And its loose, somewhat informal shape means it's not well suited to a tightly clipped, formal hedge look. If you've got a soggy low spot, a rain garden, or property near standing water where other shrubs have failed, Buttonbush solves a problem almost nothing else on this list can touch. If your yard drains well, this isn't the plant for you. How to compare the 5 options, laid side by side. Each of these 5 earns its spot for a different reason. For year-round screening, wax myrtle stands alone on this list, provided you're in a warm enough climate to grow it. For sheer speed of coverage, Ninebark and wax myrtle are both strong. Cold hardy Ninebark being the better choice anywhere winters get seriously cold. For flowers and multi-season ornamental value, Serviceberry is hard to beat. For birds and pollinators specifically, American Elderberry and Buttonbush both perform exceptionally well, just in very different soil conditions. For a genuinely wet site, Buttonbush is really the only option here suited to standing water. None of these 5 is a strong choice for deep, dry shade. That's a gap worth being honest about. And it would take a different plant entirely to solve that particular problem. Realistic cost comparison. The actual math depends on your property line's length, how many plants that requires at appropriate spacing, and whether you buy small nursery starts or pricier large specimens. 100 feet of boundary, spaced 4 to 6 feet apart. Might need 15 to 25 plants depending on the species, and 1 to 3 gallon plants from a local nursery or conservation district sale cost dramatically less than 5 gallon specimens bought for instant impact. Budget for mulch. Occasional temporary irrigation through the first season or 2, possible deer protection, and a handful of replacement plants. Since not everything survives its first year, no matter how carefully you plant, I won't promise a specific dollar figure, since that depends on your fence alternative, regional labor costs, and your patience. But homeowners tend to save the most when they buy smaller plants and let them grow. Plant in phases rather than all at once. Choose species genuinely suited to the site instead of fighting the conditions, and source locally rather than through specialty mail order. 3 example living fence designs. The 4-season suburban screen works well for a typical backyard where winter privacy matters. Anchor the planting with wax myrtle, where your climate allows it, staggered in a loose double row rather than a single rigid line. which avoids the flat, solid wall look and lets the plants develop natural, varied shapes as they mature. The flowering wildlife boundary suits a homeowner more interested in birds and blooms than absolute winter density. Combine Serviceberry for spring flowers and fall color with American Elderberry in any consistently moist stretch of the same boundary, giving each room to reach its natural, looser form rather than shearing them into a uniform hedge. The budget property line screen fits a longer rural or suburban boundary where cost and patience matter most. Start with the section closest to the house or the area with the most privacy need. Using small, affordable Ninebark or Serviceberry starts, and extend the planting outward in following seasons as budget allows. Rather than trying to plant the entire line at once, planting and establishment guide. Most of these shrubs go in best in early spring or fall, when temperatures are moderate and rainfall tends to be more reliable. Measure and mark your planting area first, accounting for mature width, and consider a staggered double row rather than a single straight line if you have the space. Since it fills in more naturally and creates better screening depth, dig the hole wider than the root ball. But no deeper planting. Too deep is one of the most common and most damaging mistakes, since it can suffocate the root crown over time. If the roots are circling tightly inside their nursery pot, gently loosen or score them before planting so they grow outward into the surrounding soil instead of continuing to spiral. Water deeply right after planting. Then keep up a consistent watering schedule through that first growing season, tapering off as the plant establishes real root growth into the native soil. Mulch 2 to 3 inches deep around the base, but pull it back a few inches from the actual stem, since mulch piled against the trunk invites rot and pests. If deer or rabbits are active in your area, protect young plants with fencing or repellent until they're established enough to handle some browsing. Skip the fertilizer. In most cases, native shrubs planted in reasonably appropriate soil rarely need it. And pushing fast, soft growth with fertilizer can actually make young plants more vulnerable to pests and winter damage. Give every plant the room its mature size actually requires, even though it looks sparse and unfinished at first. And if a plant is clearly struggling after a full season, not just adjusting, but genuinely declining, it's usually better to replace it early than to keep nursing a lost cause for years. That first 1 to 3 growing seasons really does determine most of what happens afterward. Get the establishment right, and the plant more or less takes care of itself from there. Common mistakes. A few errors show up again and again with new living fences. Buying the largest, most expensive plants for instant fullness often backfires. Smaller plants frequently catch up to and surpass larger ones within a few years, since they suffer less transplant shock. Planting too closely for immediate density creates overcrowding and awkward pruning decisions later. Choosing a species outside its true native range means a plant poorly adapted to your actual conditions. Even if the tag said native, ignoring winter leaf loss on deciduous species leaves people disappointed every December. Planting a wet soil lover like Buttonbush in dry ground, or a moisture-hungry Ninebark in a parched corner, sets the plant up to struggle, regardless of other care. Installing thirsty young shrubs where there's no practical way to water them through the first season is asking for failure. Relying on a single species across a very long hedge creates risk, since one pest or disease can wipe out the whole screen at once. Shearing every shrub into a rigid rectangle sacrifices most of the flowers and berries that made native species worth choosing in the first place. Planting beneath overhead utility lines guarantees a fight with the power company down the road. And expecting full privacy within the first season sets up disappointment that has nothing to do with the plant and everything to do with the timeline. Final recommendation: If I had to point you toward the single most versatile option on this list, it would be Ninebark. Simply because of how wide a range of soil and climate conditions it tolerates. For year-round privacy specifically, wax myrtle is the strongest choice, provided your winters allow it. For wildlife value, American elderberry and buttonbush both earn that title, just for very different sites. One for consistently moist ground, one for genuinely wet or flooded conditions. For a difficult, waterlogged corner of the yard that's defeated everything else you've tried. Buttonbush is close to a specialist solution. And for a patient homeowner working through a limited budget over several seasons, Serviceberry rewards that patience with flowers, fruit, and fall color that few fast-growing shrubs can match. Which one is actually right for you comes down to your zone, your soil, and how much winter privacy genuinely matters to your household. There's no universal answer here. Only the honest fit between a plant's real needs and your yard's real conditions. Conclusion and call to action. A fence starts losing value the moment the last board goes up. A well-chosen living screen does the opposite, thin and unimpressive at first, then a little fuller every year after that, eventually becoming something a stack of lumber never could a place birds actually visit. A spot that changes with the seasons instead of just weathering them. If any of this has you thinking differently about that property line you've been putting off, start with 3 simple things. Measure the space you actually have to work with. Take an honest look at your sunlight and how your soil drains after a hard rain. And check which of these 5 or which close regional relative of them is genuinely native to where you live. Drop a comment with your state, your USDA zone, how much space you're working with, or which of these 5 you're leaning toward. I read all of them, and it helps me know what to cover next. If this was useful, consider subscribing to Easy Garden. There's more coming on building a yard that works with your climate instead of against it.